Much has been written about the influx of about 5,000 immigrants to South Africa in the early to mid-19th century. Information has been researched, analysed and documented. The movement has been labelled colonial, settler intrusive, and generally now seen in a very negative light. It's not the intention of this presentation to provide an architectural treatise or a revisionist perspective on a way of life that is now past, but to understand that the recession in Great Britain was of such magnitude that it led people to leave their homes, some desperate, some with a sense of adventure, and the need for all to make a new beginning. This book concentrates mainly on the social aspects of starting life in a new country, how the immigrants often landed up in lonely, isolated places where the need to build a home in whatever way possible was a prime imperative. Although the main focus is on the houses they built, this inevitably involves recounting family sagas, for the two are connected. Many of their descendants still live in these homes, and it has become an urgent priority to record their stories whilst still possible. The other aim of this book was to bring the plight of these houses back into the public consciousness, despite the fact that they do not reflect the heritage of the entire population. Many of the houses are decaying, derelict, or even demolished. Some are lucky enough to be used for other purposes, while the really fortunate ones have been cherished, but they all form an important link to the past. A white circle was drawn around Pietermaritzburg as the pivotal point, and farmhouses were selected for inclusion throughout the Midlands and its perimeter. This was a difficult task, as any could have been included among the 38 that make up the corpus of this book. It was purely coincidental that the original owners of 3 of the properties featured came to South Africa on the ill-fated Minerva in 1850, so I thought it would be interesting to talk about these 3 families and the fate of their houses, as they had a common and challenging start to their South African life. And as one couple, John and Mary Anderson, were my great-great-grandparents, the stage was set as their ship with 287 passengers sank as they reached their destination, and many people were left destitute. The Minerva was a stately converted frigate made of teak and had formerly been in the service of the East India Company. The voyage to Natal had been more pleasant than most, despite raging winds as they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, only to lie becalmed for a day until a fair wind sprang up and they reached Durban on the 3rd of July 1850. Captain Moy was a good sailor, but inexperienced in the ways of the southern seas. He dropped 1 anchor, not the required 2. The wind freshened, as it so often does at the coast in the evening, and the Minerva was dashed onto the rocks. Fortunately, nobody died, but the boat eventually sank, and many valuables went down. The beach was littered with debris. A racehorse swam ashore, and my ancestor was very lucky, as his toolbox was washed up, later enabling him to carry out his work. An engineer by training, he'd possibly been made redundant and decided to emigrate. He desperately needed a wife, as his fiancée flatly refused to leave home, and as luck would have it, met his future wife through a chance introduction. Mary had an adventurous spirit and did not even have time to bid her widowed mother adieu, as they married and 3 weeks later set sail. Little did they know what was in store for them, which was probably a good thing, but Mary was a prudent lady and had sewn 100 gold sovereigns into the hem of her petticoat, something they desperately needed. A month after the wreck, they made the 120-kilometer journey to their allocated land on the banks of the Alovo River, to Bern, near the present-day Richmond, where John built a house and a little yellow wood church, but the unsuitability of the land and the fact that he was not a farmer prompted him to go to Durban, where he could use his engineering skills. He built the machinery for the first windmill in Durban, and from being a millwright progressed to making wagons and became quite prosperous, eventually moving his family to Pinetown. John and Mary's daughter, Elizabeth, but always known as Lizzie, was the first child to be born in Bern, and she became the connection to the Donnybrook area where the Andersons later largely congregated. Lizzie married Arthur William Mallandane in 1872, and he had a farm called Lillydale, named after the acres of arum lilies in the Fleay near the river. Their first house was an unpretentious cottage comprising 4 basic rooms. It still stands, some 148 years later. Fragments of wallpaper line the thick shale walls in what must have been the living room, and the royal oak corrugated iron roof is still intact, although somewhat patched. They farmed sheep for a living. Today, chickens and cows wander through the deserted cottage, and the wind blows through the windows, the glass long gone. Lillydale had a somewhat better fate. It was sold by the Mallandanes to Lizzie's brothers, Tom and Johnny, and in 1902 they built a large rambling farmhouse, also of burnt bricks, and the corrugated iron roof, sent from England and despite being rusted at sea, remains in place. Lillydale still belongs to the Anderson family. It passed from Johnny to his son Francis, then to his nephew Clive, and so to his son Harvey, and then to his nephew Struan Anderson. The big house had a new incarnation as a home to Alzheimer's sufferers, a tribute to Clive's wife, Belle, who suffered from the illness. Lizzie's brothers were wagon builders and transport riders, but as the railway neared Johannesburg, the need for wagons diminished. They decided to join their sister in the Donnybrook area. WK, that was Willie Anderson, bought the farm next door to Lillydale for 15 shillings an acre and named it Maxwell. He built his house of baked bricks, and to buy the timber to fuel the fires to bake the bricks had to ride about 70 miles on a round trip to Thornville Junction railhead, where he also bought furniture. Always a perfectionist, the house and outbuildings formed a perfect square in which to turn a span of oxen. He can be regarded as one of the first organic farmers. The soil on Maxwell was extremely poor, so he started a series of huge compost heaps, and soon the neighborhood followed suit. He became a household name in Natal and built up a huge farming empire. Alas, he had no heirs, and the farm was sold, first to the Collar family and then to the Crooks brothers. The farm was put to timber, and the house is now a travesty of its former self. The decorative woodwork is broken, the gutters have fallen off, and the staff who work there have blankets up as curtains to further contribute to an air of general dereliction. The area became Anderson country, with Tom's sons, Max and Alfred, farming Emerald Dale and Mabethan respectively. Emerald Dale is still farmed by Andersons, and Charles Anderson now runs it as a very successful timber concern. Their homes are the legacy of a pioneering family whose land once stretched as far as the eye could see and beyond. Also aboard the Minerva was the family MacLeod, first mentioned when their 2 small sons ran up from the beach after the wreck, clutching their christening mugs. The 4th son of George and Ellen MacLeod, she who had made a name for herself by writing letters to her sister, which were later edited by Ruth Gordon, and published as Dear Louisa, was Frederick, known as Fred. He eventually married a girl of Irish parentage, and so they called their new home Blarney Cottage. Fred was busy sawing timber for his house even before he married in 1878, but they only moved in by January 1880. Blarney Cottage is one of the few remaining Natal settler cottages, if not the only one. It is a proclaimed national monument, yet there is no plaque. The yellowwood floors show signs of the pit saws. The green bricks bear the date of building and also family names. The original mortar was mud, which has now weathered over 140 years. To enter the now empty cottage with its handle half chewed off by cattle requires willpower, great willpower. Tattered wallpaper is the only evidence of restoration in 1985 by Barclays Bank, the Natal Provincial Administration, and the National Monuments Council. This cottage belongs to the Provincial Museum Service by virtue of a gift by one of the descendants, Donald MacLeod. Yet its fate seems to hang between the various heritage agencies and perhaps the local municipality. One wonders what will become of it. In contrast, Heaventree has fared very well, although its original owners, despite travelling above deck, suffered the same fate as all the passengers of the Minerva, having to scramble ashore in their nightshirts. All that the Wraiths recovered from the wreck was a hogshead of beer with the family name on it. They appeared to be comfortably off, so what brought them to this colonial outpost? A spirit of adventure, perhaps? Family tradition is that having once been landed gentry, they were trying to reassert themselves. Like the other settlers, Robert and Sarah Wraith and their 6 children made their way to Bern, but had no intention of staying there, as they had come to South Africa with a business plan: to farm merino sheep. A search began for suitable land for merino rearing, and on coming down from Minerva, they found the right conditions in the Bushman's River Valley, close to the present-day Escort. The earliest picture of Heaventree dates from about 1880. It shows a modest green brick pioneer house under a thatched roof. The thatched roof appears to account for there being no lean-to veranda to counteract the heat. The family settled on 5 farms, but in due course the Crown Commissioner arrived and claimed 2 shillings and 6pence per acre for what was termed Crown land. Luckily, at the same time, a rich aunt who lived in the Devon village of Heaventree died, leaving a large legacy to Robert Wraith, who could then settle his debts and called one of the farms Heaventree after the village. It is the only farm which is still in the Wraith family possession. It was Sarah and Robert's grandson, Douglas, who became the legendary judge-president of the Transvaal. He married the 19-year-old Monica Maritz, daughter of Geert Maritz, and she brought a sense of beauty and domestic refinement to Heaventree. She was chatelaine of the property for over 70 years, until her death at 92. It was at a family gathering in May 1972, when celebrations were afoot to celebrate Douglas Wraith's birthday, that a fire broke out in the loft. It was an electric fault that caused the thatch to catch fire. It was tinder dry, as for decades had served as insulation to the corrugated iron laid above it. The result was a conflagration of such intensity that the plaster peeled off the walls, revealing the green mud bricks beneath. By common consent, the family decided to restore their heritage home. A concrete collar was constructed above the old walls to hold them together, while yellow wood, rather than the original deal wood, was sourced from nearby demolished houses. The Heaventree dwelling before the fire was a typical Natal farmhouse with its wraparound verandas, which had no less than 13 doors opening onto them. In the restoration, the bedroom wing acquired an internal passage, and only the front lean-to veranda was rebuilt. When Monica died, her son Gary and his wife, Marie France, had the house redone, with Nick Grice as the architect. Heaventree now boasts covered verandas on all four sides of the house, reflecting that enduring feature of Natal farmhouses. Two of my all-time favorites, amongst many, simply have to feature in this presentation. One is Cotswold and the other is Tweedy Hall. Cotswold, lyrically beautiful, with its roots deep in the history of Natal, lies forever dreaming, facing it as it does the foothills of the Drakensberg and the faraway Giant's Castle. Duncan Mackenzie came to Natal as a Burn settler on the Unicorn, leaving Liverpool in June 1850. He too had a traumatic start to his Natal life, as the seas were so rough they could not cross the bar, and their luggage was transferred to other ships, but much of it was lost. Like many other Burn settlers, Duncan rejected his allocated plot, and in order to make a living, he rose from roadmaker to the superintendent of roads. He saved 300 sovereigns and bought the farm Leerbosch from the Voortrekker leader Gert Maritz. An astute man, he retired at 40, having accumulated vast tracts of land, including Cotswold, on which he ran his cattle herds and horses. Cotswold was originally a Voortrekker stopping point when they moved their cattle to the Sweetveld. Duncan and Margaret's third son was also named Duncan, and his name became synonymous with matters military, ending up as Brigadier Sir Duncan Mackenzie. He had married Catherine Agnes MacArthur, and their early life together was somewhat peripatetic, but eventually he bought Cotswold from his father at a very reasonable price. The house took 5 years to build. The date, 1889, was carved for posterity on the gateposts. Much of the ironstone used in the construction was brought from Leerbosch. There are wide, quarry-tiled verandas to the north, south, and east. The veranda overlooking the garden has parallel timber posts, brackets, and cross brackets which attractively counterbalance the two pointed gables and chimneys. The wide hall runs from back to the front veranda in typical Natal style of the period. It is in turn bisected by a passage connecting the living areas to the bedroom. The high ceilings, doors, and sash windows are all made of Oregon pine. This enormous house was well suited to Duncan Mackenzie and his wife, as they had 7 children. The farm remained in the family until 1973, when it was sold to Chris and Penny Worrell. The barn and stables were built of sandstone, with arched entrances wide enough for a loaded wagon to pass through. A vicious tornado swept through the valley in 2014, which completely dislodged the 3 high-pitched corrugated iron rooftops, but the old barn stood firm. Since being repaired, it served as a reception venue for marriage celebrations of the present incumbent, Matthew Worrell, who wed Nicola Colvin in 2016. The family line continues, as they have since had a child. Another house that has been cherished over the years is Tweedy Hall. Situated in the Petrovstroom area near the Dargle Valley, it has remained the property of the Morton and then Marshall families until very recently. It has always been a family home. The Mortons married in 1868. Eliza and James married at Eliza's family home, Tweedy Hall, where her father was the laird. Immediately after the ceremony, the couple left Scotland for London to join the movement to the colonies on the Prince Alfred. They travelled first class and had to furnish their own cabin for the 2.5-month voyage. They too had drama at sea, and the ship nearly overturned during a ferocious storm. On reaching Port Natal, Durban, they travelled to Pietermaritzburg as the train went no further, and during their 6-week sojourn there, they rode around the surrounding area to find their ideal property. This they found. "It reminds me of Scotland," said Eliza. Bounded in the south and the west by the Amgani River, now in the Midmar Dam area, they bought the land, and they lived in their little cottage until moving up the hill to a stone house, which served them well until their permanent home was built 23 years later. In the interim, James played a busy role in the life of the colony. He eventually owned 12,000 acres and put up the first fencing in 1875, much to the ire of his neighbors. He was an entrepreneur by nature and imported the first mowing machine into Natal before taking on an agency from London, selling these machines and agricultural equipment to local farmers. Another first was the building of the first silo in Natal. Such was its importance that the governor, Sir Charles Mitchell, arrived by train for the opening. James built up his livestock herd and eventually became chairman of the Natal Land Board. James was now ready to build his final home, appointing William Street Wilson as architect. He was one of the busiest architects in Natal and was responsible for the Pietermaritzburg City Hall. Tweedy Hall took 5 years to build, using 230,000 bricks and yellow wood locally sourced from the Carkloof area for the doors, windows and ceilings. All the windows are sash-styled. A veranda wraps around 3 sides of the house, whilst the upper veranda, supported by timber posts, brackets and freezers, all painted white, contrasts beautifully with the red brickwork. A pedimented portico leads to the handsome front door, which, in English style, is complemented by yet another door as protection against the weather. The house faces south, English style, as was the fashion. There was no knowledge of the differences in climate at that time. The house was furnished in 1891-2 with furniture custom made by John Finch & Co. of London. The family moved into their new home with their 4 children in 1892, complete with its circular drive to allow for horse-drawn carriages and wagons. An extraordinary sequence of events meant that the house was owned and run by spinster members of the family for 2 generations, covering some 75 years. Consequently, the house remained almost unchanged until it was left to the eldest of the 4th generation family, David Marshall and his wife Mary. The Marshalls devoted much time and money to ensure the maintenance of the house and garden. Originally painted in dark, somber colors, the interior was reworked in lighter colors that all add to its spacious feeling. On a practical level, they added 2 bathrooms, using the Swedish system of hot pumps to avoid changes to the exterior. Times changed. The Marshalls leased Tweedy Hall to a consortium, mainly of ladies who brought new life to the old house as they ran it as a wedding and function venue. Alas, COVID-19 put paid to this. But it has now changed hands again, this time to a family, which means new life for this old house. Where Forest Cliff once stood evokes a curious sense of loss. There were families that lived and loved here. Children played in the garden, their laughter and tears forgotten. Where the chickens and the cows, the dogs and the cats? They had a pet monkey too. All have disappeared into the mists of time, with old photographs the only legacy, and a garden laden with memories, now the home of bush pigs and the occasional leopard. Wonderful old houses like those I have mentioned dot the landscape. One flashes by in a car or spots one on a hill, and then they're gone from sight and probably from mind, but they reflect a part of Natal's history. The loss of each building, whether humble or grand, reflects on us all. How many of these examples of Natal's unique architecture will survive?